to the Leo Training Podcast with Joe DeLeo. You'll hear in-depth interviews and tips from world-class athletes, coaches, and industry-leading experts to help you train smarter and improve at what you love to do. Train smarter, get stronger, move better, race faster. Here's your host, Joe DeLeo.
We're back with another brand new episode this week on the Leo Training Podcast. And I've got a very special guest for this week's interview. I did a bit of research and digging around and was able to reconnect with Jeff O'Connor, former Master RKC. Jeff was a 2001 winner of the North America's Strongest Man in the 275-pound division. He's also been in the United States Navy as well as a career firefighter. And he has spent a majority of his time working with youth athletes and coaching them in strength training. Jeff was also featured in 2 classic digital products alongside Chief SFG Brett Jones. Those were Kettlebells for Power Athletes and Kalosthenos Kettlebells from the Ground Up Part 2. Jeff's latest work is an ebook that he co-authored with Senior SFG Brandon Hetzler titled The New Language of Movement, Volume 1, The Push-Pull Strategy. So I'll make sure to have a link in the show notes for that as well. So without further ado, we're going to roll to episode 80 with Jeff O'Connor, Outlaw Strength. Jeff O'Connor, welcome to the Leo Training Podcast. Thanks so much for taking the time out of your busy schedule to come on to the show. I am extremely excited and honored to have you on the show. Thank you again for coming on.
Well, thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, my pleasure, man. You're a very well-respected and individual in the Strong First and RKC communities, and I've seen some of your work firsthand in Kalosthenos. So looking forward to having the opportunity to sit down pseudo face-to-face and have a chat with you.
Yeah, this is my first FaceTime experience.
Fantastic. So I always give the guests an opportunity to just introduce themselves, let the audience know who they are. I have a pretty diverse audience that follows the podcast, both on the strength and endurance community side. So let them know, who Jeff O'Connor is, where you're located, and kind of your professional athletic background.
Not a lot to tell. I'm just a guy who's always liked picking stuff up and putting it down for no real reason, and always been a fan of strength and performance, and that kind of led me to a world where I went out and started learning, and then just got asked to start training some athletes, and from there it just kind of happened, and did a few things in the RKC world when that was young, and earlier on with the FMS, and learned a lot, met a lot of great people from that. And other than that, I no longer really go out and do any of that stuff. I stay here in my little hole in the woods and train a few athletes and go fight fire for my day job.
That's awesome. So you're a career firefighter, correct?
Yes.
Excellent. How did you get involved in that as a career, occupation?
Well, every little boy wants to be a firefighter, don't they?
That's right. That's right. But did you find that some of the things that you were trained for, like, carried over, kind of fed one another, both in terms of helping the occupation, but also what you were doing on the strength side with kettlebells?
Oh, certainly. I mean, in the end, at some point when you're in there fighting a fire, it does boil down to just a grunt physical job. I came to it a little bit late. I did a little stint in the Navy, and I got beat up a little bit in there and wasn't able to use my body very well when I came out for a few years. So it took a while before I got to the point where I could even be a firefighter. So I didn't start that till I was almost 30 years old. But, there's certainly a carryover because as a firefighter, you do have to respond like an athlete. And the more athletic you are, the less likely you are to get injured and the better you're going to perform your job.
That's right. That's right. I lost my pen. So the first topic we have down here, this is pretty interesting. So one of the things you've done in your career is you trained for the North America's Strongest Man competition while coaching and also being a fireman. So, sorry, go ahead.
Well, I wasn't actually coaching at the time,
Okay.
at least as best as I recall.
Okay.
I mean, I'm getting pretty old. It's hard to keep everything straight. I think that I actually trained for that and was pretty much done competing when I started training. Okay. I did try to make a little comeback after that, and when I was training athletes, and the bottom line is it was too much and something had to suffer, and it was my training. So
sure. That was
kind of where the whole strongman thing ended.
Right. Yeah, because of the time commitment.
Mm-hmm.
So when you were at the time juggling that between being a fireman and training for, how did you kind of balance that? Like what would that kind of training schedule look like, and how did you kind of fit it in around a very physically demanding, job?
Well, when you're young, it's not as physically demanding as when you're old. You don't need as much sleep. So a sleepless night doesn't necessarily mean the next training day is lost when you're,
right.
You're young. It's a little different now, but, I've always lived in a very physical world. I grew up in the country. My dad and my grandfather were both unbelievably strong. Some of the things that I saw them do is what inspired me. And I just always lived in a world where, you just picked stuff up and carried it off, or you picked it up and threw it to wherever it needed to go. So the transition to strongman was kind of an easy thing, and it just really fit into the world I lived in out in the country. There was always something to pick up and walk off with or tip over or whatever. Plus I was a gym rat at the time. So, there was always, weights to be lifted to build that base level of strength. And my training was just whatever, whenever. I would go to work after I went to the RKC and really learned a lot more about how to effectively use a kettlebell and my body as a whole. I would keep kettlebells up at the fire station, and I would do what then would be very light recovery workouts, which, now would be really hard workouts. But anyway, I might do some band work, some stretching. So my day might have 5 training sessions. It might have none. And that 5 training sessions might be a stretching session. It might be a mobility session for 15 minutes. Then I'd go split some wood, and then I'd come back and do some event training. And then I'd go work on the tractor, and then I'd come back and do some kettlebell conditioning, just whatever. I mean, it wasn't always like that, but I had a really neat gym in Tulsa. I live about 45 minutes away from Tulsa. With some great power lifters and Highland Games athletes and guys that got started in strongman. And didn't matter what you did, there was always somebody that could do something more, better. And it was just a really neat training environment. So those are the guys that got me started in strongman. Just I don't know. It just kind of all fit together.
That's awesome.
It wasn't a big transition.
Yeah, and it seems like a lot of that really kind of resonates with your personality, because you definitely seem like you enjoy being outdoors as much as you can be. Is that right?
It's really bothering me to sit indoors for this phone call right now.
Well, I appreciate you doing it. Thank you. So one of the other topics that I'm really interested to hear from is I checked out your website, Outlaw Strength, and you've done a ton of work focusing on youth athletic development. And
it's funny, that website's been down for like 10 years.
Yes. Well, you know what? I don't know how I got onto it. I went to the RKC site because I was looking at some of the DVDs, and your profile's listed on there, and it had the web URL. And when I Google searched it, it doesn't come up. But for some reason, when I clicked on it, I think through the RKC site, it popped up. All right.
Yeah, there's no current information there.
Yeah.
The funny thing is, the first guy that I trained after the RKC, he lived in a computer world. And
wow.
I was training him, and he was he was afraid of me enough that he would do all the work for my website. And then we got to be friends, and he wasn't afraid of me anymore. So he didn't want to do all the work, and I certainly wasn't going to. So I've never been to that website.
No way. Oh,
no,
my gosh.
I haven't.
Oh, my gosh.
But it hasn't been active for at least 10 years.
Wow. That's hilarious. So I would love to hear some of your thoughts on, your approach. Where do you start with youth athletic development? What do you look for? Does it depend on the activity or sport, or are we just trying to really focus on the basics and the fundamentals and make sure that the kids are really moving well first before we're really adding on the strength component?
Well, I think everything boils down to basics and fundamentals. One of my favorite quotes is the difference between good and great is the great are always better at the basics. That being said, a swimmer probably doesn't need as much muscle mass as a offensive lineman. So, you can obviously do some more specific things for their needs, but learning how to move, developing appropriate movement, learning how to lift, learning how to change directions, how to react, that's a fairly universal thing. That's just developing human motor skills. And the more you can get those motor skills developed and integrated, then the more functional, better human being you'll be, and the better athlete you can be.
Yeah, absolutely. For sure. So when you're doing that, specifically working with, a youth population, do you try to keep it more structured, or do you just try to make it kind of a play environment where they're having a lot of fun?
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, go ahead. No.
It just depends on what you're talking about when you say youth. To me, a college athlete is still a youth.
Okay.
But a lot of times, when people say youth, you're thinking more elementary school. And to me, if I have an elementary school group, then it's going to be organized play. Okay. They don't understand work, and they're just there to have fun. And if they don't have fun and they're not entertained, they're not going to want to come back. And then,
right.
There's no reason for them parents to bring them someplace they don't want to be. So it has to be much more play oriented. And it's all about, at that age, it's about acquiring motor skills. Their nervous system is sprouting off everywhere, and just trying to guide it into appropriate movements. And then, we'll get some learning. It's not that they don't like to work. I mean, a 9-year-old is going to be, happy to deadlift and think they're strength training. It doesn't matter if it's a 12 kilo bell or a 10-pound medicine ball or whatever. They're strength training. They're an athlete. So, we work in a component, but if we have some 7 or 8 year old kids and we have a 45-minute session, probably 35 is going to be motor skill oriented play, and 10 minutes is going to be learning to lift.
That's great. That's awesome.
And then obviously it just changes as they get older, as the demands for strength and or size increase. We want to develop that work capacity. And then if they're going to be a high school or college athlete, then my goal is always to prepare them for the next level. And, maybe somebody who's going to be a junior varsity swimmer at a small school does not need to do a body weight and a half power clean if that's as far as their ambition is. They're just showing up and being part of the team. But if somebody is going to be a college swimmer, well, maybe they do need that explosive power to come off. If they're trying to earn a scholarship, pay for part of their college there, then we're going to focus obviously a little bit harder on that, because those are people who've made the commitment to work harder and achieve more.
Right.
So you got to train where they're at.
Yep. Absolutely. So you would kind of adjust the percentage of the session, like you said, if it was a college athlete versus elementary or a high school athlete, in terms of organized play versus the, pure strength focused work.
Absolutely. But every now and then I'll try to put them all together, and there's nothing better than watching a college linebacker play one-legged tag with a 6-year-old female soccer player, and they're both just giggling and having a blast. And there's a lot going on neurologically and athletically there.
Right.
That, there's a time and place. I mean, it can't all be work all the time, because if you don't develop an enjoyment and a love of the training and performance process, it won't be a lifetime endeavor. If it's not a lifetime endeavor, you're never going to succeed at the level you're capable of.
Right. Absolutely. So with that being said, emphasis on the fundamentals especially for the younger elementary, high school motor skill acquisition, motor skill development. Is there anything that in particular that we should be emphasizing, like for example, the hip hinge, because they're spending so much time sitting at a desk all day in school, those types of things, making sure they have access to that range of motion and they own that pattern?
I think that there's a lot of confusion on what is the biggest priority, but the biggest priority is what you can work on, what you can actually enable that athlete to make some change with. If I'm seeing an athlete once a month because they live 3 hours away, I can't do the same thing as an athlete I'm seeing 5 days a week that is right here at the local high school and showing up out here all the time. So, first and foremost, you've got to make the interventions that are going to keep them the healthiest and allow them to play. And maybe that's teaching them a hip hinge so that they can learn to access their hips and deadlift and clean as appropriately as possible in that once a month session you get with them. Versus there's a lot of different things that I may work on at different times, depending upon how often I have that athlete and what their particular needs or challenges are. Right. But first and foremost, I'm always going to say it's injury prevention, whatever that is in your program, because, I train a lot of kids, but I don't train Olympic athletes. I train kids. We have a pretty good record of the ones who want to go to college getting the opportunity to play their sport in college. But what I'm far more proud of is I've been training kids for over 10 years and, I've never had a minute of lost practice or play time due to a non-contact injury. So if, I'm not going to make a pro athlete out of a kid that is the best they can do is varsity in high school. You can never make that claim, and anybody that says they can do that is probably a little misguided. But we can help that athlete have the best experience with athletics and however that fits into their life possible. And they're going to have that experience by getting better at their sport, and they're going to get better at their sport by getting to play their sport and be coached. Right. It's no fun, and they don't learn very much when they're sitting on the bench icing their knee because they had a non-contact injury.
Absolutely.
So let's keep them on the field.
Absolutely. So I'm just curious, why do you feel it's important to emphasize in terms of the training goals, one of them being injury prevention, when a lot of people like to go towards like the performance or high performance end?
There's no difference. I mean, you're not going to perform. You cannot separate health and fitness for very long. I was the perfect example of that. I was very fit in certain ways for my sport as a strongman, but I wasn't healthy. I was sick all the time. I was injured all the time. I was living in lizard brain survival all the time. My joke was I could flip your car over, but if I had to make a lap around it, I was going to pull a hamstring. You can't separate health and fitness for very long. And at some point, if you, for Gray's term, that if you stack fitness on dysfunction, something's got to give somewhere, and it will. So you're not really doing the athlete a service by helping them squat more worse.
Right.
I always go back to the automotive analogies of, the easy ones for old country boys like me. If you're souping up the engine, but not aligning the front end, it just allows you to have a bigger crash. So right. If you soup up the engine on your lawnmower, it's probably not going to be that big a crash. But, if you soup up the engine on a sports car and don't align that front end, then you can have something pretty spectacular. So the ones that I hesitate to use the term overpowered, because I don't know that I've ever seen anybody who was too strong for their sport. I've seen people who put too much time into lifting more weights and not enough time into practicing their sport or the skills necessary to be successful. But, the thing that gets thrown around most is people who have way more power than they have movement ability. Those are the guys that have a lot of non-contact, ankle sprains and the aching backs and things like that cut into training or practice time.
Yeah, absolutely. That makes a ton of sense to me. So you mentioned something there that I think is a really important point about health and fitness and how we need to work on both of those things in tandem. And we can be, very fit, but also unhealthy. And just sort of, I guess, working with, athletes from high school up to the master's level and in between myself, one of the things I try to do is educate them on that point. And obviously you do as well. What's one thing that you try to communicate to your athletes so that they understand that and they don't potentially sacrifice their health, to put themselves in harm's way for performance or a lift or a rep or something like that?
Well, it's a constant conversation with them. There's always going to be another day to train. There's always going to be, another rep. Sometimes, when it comes to the lifting standpoint, we preach from day one, there's going to be a rep go wrong. Don't let it stop you from training. We talk about self-spotting and not chasing bad reps and all that type of stuff. But when it comes to, there's no excuse for a training injury. So from an orthopedic standpoint, there's no reason to train if you're training appropriately. If you're training smart with appropriate progressions, you don't get injured. Now, if you're a power or Olympic lifter and lifting is your sport, and like I tell everybody, if you push the limits of the body, you will find them. Okay. If you go for all there is, but if you're a basketball player, there is no reason for you to be maxing on a low bar squat as a sophomore in high school. Now, unfortunately, we see that all the time, but we have kids all over the place that are doing maximum repetitions that have no concept of even how to do the lift.
Right.
And that's a whole other conversation that I have to get my soapbox out for. But back to where you originally started with nutrition. I try to stay in my swim lane. I'm not a nutritional expert. I've been fortunate enough to be around some smart people. I've read a few things. I've picked up a few things. But mostly I tell kids, if it was a food 300 years ago, it's still a food today. And, an apple beats a Snickers bar. If it's an apple from grandpa's backyard that has ripened all the way on the tree and hasn't been sprayed with everything, it's better for you than one you're getting down at the grocery store. If it comes in plastic wrapper, if it's powdered, it's probably not really food. Right. So use that stuff with caution. And I'm not saying a kid should never have a protein shake or anything like that. There's some stuff that obviously works and is appropriate, but for the most part, I just try to get them to eat a lot less cheap, crappy stuff. We talk all the time. It's continual educational / berating process about, working out and practicing is the easy part, but that's not where you make progress. You make progress from what happens after that when you recover and your body adapts, and it can only adapt as well as possible if you're feeding it right and you're allowing it to rest and recover. And that is a very difficult thing when you're talking about kids at the high school and college level, because it's crazy. But, anytime there's a team event, what are they feeding them? Pizza, hot dogs. We're poisoning our kids when sport is supposed to be our answer to health in today's world, since we don't have any sort of PE program in most of the schools. So anyway, it's one of those uphill fights, but if you can get them to go to bed every now and then, and you can get them to eat one less candy bar and one more piece of fruit, it's kind of a win.
Yeah, absolutely. And probably I throw in a little less time on social media too.
Wow. I hear that there's something called social media out there. I just hope that since I'm doing a FaceTime call, it doesn't mean I'm on Facebook now. I don't know if there's any correlation.
No, you're not. You're not. You're not on any social media, are you?
No, I'm just not that kind of guy.
No, that's all right. Trust me, as somebody that spends a lot of time in marketing, you're not missing out on too much.
I realize there's a positive side to that stuff, but I just just don't really have any interest. That's for other people.
No, that's good. That's good. You haven't. My fiance calls it book face. She doesn't call it Facebook. She calls it book face. So, yeah. Well, that's fantastic. So, next question I have for you is there something that we're focusing on too much or overemphasizing in terms of in regards to athletic development?
Well, I would say I believe so. Yes, I think that, we all come from the background we come from, and it's hard to not allow that to influence our training. And, as we become coaches, it should be a continual learning process to always get better. We can't know everything at the start, but I think we tend to get a little bit too pigeonholed sometimes. And then I think that sometimes we don't stay pigeonholed enough sometimes. Let's, say, for instance, it's become a lot more popular thanks to Gray Cook and the FMS in the last few years. People in the strength world are beginning to look at and grade movement. And maybe not everybody is pigeonholed in the FMS community, but if it wasn't for that, there wouldn't even be the conversation out there in the general fitness or the sports training world. But we can get so caught up in correctives that we forget that half kneeling or that stretch or whatever it is, if that doesn't turn into one, staying on the field, but if it doesn't turn into running faster, jumping higher, being able to do it longer, then it's not really productive time when it comes to training an athlete. Ultimately there's a broad spectrum of it. I think also, most strength coaches come from a strength background. If you look at college strength coaches, they were the baseball players or the football players that maybe weren't the best athletes or the best performers, but they were the one that got the most out of their abilities because they worked the hardest. They were in the weight room more, they were running more sprints. And so they come at everything from that standpoint. And of course that was me. I was a strength guy. I like to pick stuff up and put it down. And so it was, and that's what I was approached for originally, was to help kids get stronger. But then recognizing that there's a lot of stuff that gets missed in those individual pigeonholes, because when I started training kids, I realized there was a ton they needed that I didn't know. I was good at picking up heavy stuff and putting it down, and I was pretty good at stretching and basic mobility and stuff like that. But that was not what these high school football players or, high school softball players or whatever really needed. They needed to truly, what they needed to do was be able to process information. And that information comes a lot of different ways, and there's a lot of different misinformation at game time. Okay. They need to process things that they hear. They need to process things that they see. They need to process things that they feel. And there's all kinds of things going on in a sport to mess them up. The crowd is yelling. The coach is yelling. Dad's yelling. Players are yelling. I think all of us in middle school fell for the defensive player on the basketball court going, I'm open. There's all kinds of, there's cues to what's going on in our environment. And then there's miscues, and being able to process all that information. That is what our brain and our nervous system and our eyes and our ears and us are amazing at. But that really gets missed because all we can focus on is either this max back squat or, doing Joe MVP's super mega workout, or we just get caught up, doing an active straight leg raise, for 45 minutes and nothing else. But understanding that the human body is a lot more complex than a barbell press or a kettlebell press. It's a lot more complex than an active straight leg raise. And doesn't mean those are bad things. I do a lot of stuff with that. But how complex we are and the complexity of the world we live in, whether your sport is, in high school, it's basketball, or if you're like me and your sport is life and being, staring at 50 years old and out there doing a physical job with a bunch of young guys. It's all the same. There's a lot of information that comes in. And I think that what we mess up on is that we actually not only do we not focus on it, we skew the ability to process that information because we get so pigeonholed in one thing, that we're so focused on whatever it is.
Right. That's really interesting. So as part of processing that information or helping that athlete to do that, in addition to, improving agility and strength, just also teaching them to have much better body awareness in their spatially, like in their environment.
I'd say that's the first part of it. Okay. But if you look at the kinesthetic learning process, awareness is always the first correction, whatever that is. But the ultimate step in the kinesthetic learning process is naturalizing something. So if you have to be aware of what your foot placement is, what your shoulder alignment is, then you're never performing at the level you were designed to perform at. So ultimately, that has to be unconscious, if that makes any sense.
No, I'm following you completely, yeah.
If you're going to jump up and get a rebound, you cannot consciously stop. Think about your foot placement. Pull yourself down for perfect. Feed forward tension. Let's squeeze those glutes. Let's brace those abs so we can generate the most force. That's not how it works. Now, is there a time and place for those things? Absolutely. That's the awareness in the training process, but that is one of the very beginning stages. It's a long way from the end stage.
Wow. So how do you fit that in to teaching or developing some of those skills with some of those athletes? So within a session, would you be working on strength, whether that's, with a kettlebell or a barbell or body weight? And then would you have them do some drills that are specific to their sport so that they're carrying that over and working, on that unconscious behavior so it's naturalized?
I try to avoid terms like specific to their sport because you don't do a whole lot of sport-specific stuff because it is so inappropriate for anyone who's not at the very highest level, and I'm not even sure it is in most cases there. But we'll work on overall motor skills. Okay, we'll work on processing information, and there's some element of that in almost every training session. But the way I'm set up that I work with kids is because this isn't how it isn't how I make my living. And I really do this as just something I love to do and try not to lose too much money on it. So the way our sessions are structured is I will train individually, but I try to get kids in groups, and I may get kids from 4 different schools in 3 different sports programs that are at varying stages of in or outer season that are doing more or less. So most days I try to have a session for the kids that are in the group that is more focused on movement. Now, whether that's just some things with tissue quality, maybe some of their more corrective type of stuff, maybe some athletic skills, some visual vestibular processing stuff, or some restorative things, and then one that is a little more focused on strength and conditioning. A lot of the kids in my area, most of the kids in high school sports do some kind of lifting. So that is honestly the biggest challenge, is being able to get them to where they're able to safely and effectively lift around all the lifting they're already doing. But you just work it in. So I generally try to split those sessions up, but just because it's the performance, we call it the strength session, doesn't mean that there is not still an aspect of athleticism, motor skill acquisition, or layering within that. So it may be, if it's younger kids, it'll be a lot more of that. If it's older kids, it'll be a lot less of that. We'll be more specifically focused if they have a problem, say with they're doing a corrective, and now we're getting out of corrective. We're not talking about an active straight leg corrective, but something like a visual corrective of, let's say they have a problem with convergence. They have trouble seeing and focusing on things coming closer to them because vision screening and corrective and training is a big part of what we do. for almost every athlete we have. And so anyway, they'll do some specific homework for that, just like they would do their specific if they've got an ankle that doesn't like to move as well as the other. They'll do their corrective work there, if that makes any sense. I know I kind of went a long roundabout way with that.
No, that was great. No, that was really good. So what's an example of something that you would have in there for motor skill, like development, like a exercise or a drill or skill to help that?
Well, if we're talking in terms of processing information,
sure.
I mean, we'll do all the, athletic stance, change of direction type of stuff that's, out there, that's fairly common type of stuff. But we'll layer in a lot of cueing and miscueing. So if one of the games I like to play with the younger kids a lot, and sometimes with the older kids, is a game called Stand, Kneel, Belly. So we'll, and it's as simple as that: stand, kneel, belly. So kneeling is, we'll either do it on their knees or in a quadruped, and stand up, kneel, and lay down on your belly. There's only 3 things in stand, kneel, belly. So I'll say it and they'll pop to those positions, and then we'll gradually work in, instead of, getting up like an old man on one leg, popping from your belly or from your quadruped position up to an athletic stance. And once we get proficient with that, then we'll do a visual cue. So like arms up in the air is stand, arms out to the side is kneel, and then we'll go down to belly and hands down low. And so they'll have to go off what they see. And then we'll start changing it around, and it'll be, okay, now you believe what you see, not what you hear. So I'll hold my hands up overhead and say belly. And they have to sort out, because we get to some sports where, like if you're a track athlete, if you're a sprinter, you mostly just have to be reactive to the auditory cue.
Sure.
But most of the kids I train are not that specialized. So we're developing overall motor skills. They play football and baseball. They play volleyball and they're swimmers, whatever. Mm-hmm. We're just training human beings. So we'll add in those cues. So we'll also do things where we'll lay them on their belly and throw a tennis ball out in front of them. And when they hear it bounce, they get up and go catch it. Or when they see it, they get up and go catch it. Or when I kick them, they get up and take off running, and I'll throw it out there in front of them. So they have to be reactive to cues and miscues that are real world environment things, what we see, what we hear, what we feel, and sort all those things out.
That's cool. That's a really, really clever way to have them, it demands focus and their attention. Like they don't know sort of if it's going to be auditory, if it's going to be the sound of a ball, or if you're going to move your arm in a certain direction. So you're challenging them in so many different ways in terms of the stimulus that they're getting. So they really they're on their toes.
Well, I mean, we all know it. It's cliche at this point. The best kid in the weight room or the best kid with drills is not always your best player on the field. Mm-hmm. You can have the biggest squat and the longest broad jump and the best 40 time, but you're not the best soccer player, because sometimes you get out there in that game and you may have all the physical attributes, at least outwardly looking, speed, strength, conditioning, quickness, all this stuff can look great in a very specific setting. But when you get out there, and we've all seen it, we've all experienced it, when things just move too fast, we're just half a second late. We see it, but we know we should have got there, but we couldn't quite get there. Well, that's all that is processing information and putting forth an appropriate physical response. And that's the difference in training an athlete and doing strength training with an athlete, or doing correctives with an athlete.
That's awesome. I'm taking notes here. I got some great stuff to add into my own practice and eventually with some students I'm working with. So that's cool. Thank you. So do you use any other equipment besides kettlebells, body weight, and the barbell? Is there any other?
We use bands and medicine balls and dumbbells.
Okay. Cool. Do any of the strongmen equipment make it into some of the training sessions?
I've gotten rid of all that stuff. got a couple of big tires left out there to flip, but for the most part, strongman is not a very healthy training modality. Practicing a lot of those events, and they're not all bad. I think there's some great stuff in lifting stones and lifting logs and tipping things over, but a lot of the stuff that I don't know that it is as bad now as it was a few years ago when strongman was gaining a little more popularity. But the very heavy farmers walks, the heavy yoke walks, I'm just not a fan of that. I just don't think that I just don't think the things that support our joints and cushion our joints can take a whole lot of that with really heavy loads, and especially considering how poor most people's posture and gaits are. It's just not appropriate. So I've never really integrated very much of that, other than some stones and some tires and things like that.
Oh, so you don't have a lot of your athletes do a lot of carries. Would that be accurate?
I don't want to say they don't do a lot of carries, but they don't do a lot of heavy farmers walks.
Okay.
They will do a lot of single-sided carries. And I would say the vast majority of the carries we do, we try to go right up to the point where it challenges their gait. But if it significantly changes their gait, then I don't want to do that on a very regular basis. We will occasionally do it, but I try to not overdo that one.
Right. Makes sense. So challenges their gait, but doesn't change it. Suitcase carry, single arm.
One of the things is, just my yard here is about 5 acres, and I'll have them grab 2 light kettlebells. And when I say light, I mean a 200-pound kid, some 16-pound kettle or 16 kilo bells or something like that. And they'll walk all the way around the yard. Now, this isn't a manicured lawn. There's some ups, there's some downs, there's some things to step over and around. And they can carry it however they want. And I encourage uneven carries, maybe a rack in one side and an overhead in the other. And just try to walk equally. If you walk about, 30 yards this way, walk about 30 yards the opposite way. But they can go from farmers to overhead to rack position, any of those different things, and change as often as they want. But that's a significant amount of time carrying something around, and that really challenges their posture. Yeah. Yeah. So we'll do that a whole lot more than I'll try to put 300 pounds in each hand and race with it.
Right. Yeah. Plus I can see for walking that distance, and then they're changing the positions, with the bells, and really forcing them to kind of be aware of, left to right differences in the body.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Now, if I'm really feeling mean, we'll take the whole mile driveway circuit. That's got a lot more ups and downs.
Oh man, I bet you they're pretty tired after that one.
Oh yeah, but
nice.
it's a good kind of tired.
That's right. Got in some good work. So do you have any upcoming projects or seminars, or is there anything you're working on in the background in terms of teaching?
Well, I don't get out in the world very much, but funny you should ask. And it just finished some work I've started with a good friend of mine that I respect very much, Brandon Hetzler. Mm-hmm. People in the SFG, RKC, FMS community, I'm sure will recognize him. He is he's absolutely brilliant, and we've finally decided to put out a series of eBooks on training. So we did some filming of a few things for the initial one that hopefully will be getting out there before very long. So I got that going. I guess that's about it. I don't really get out and do much else.
That's
but
awesome.
He came to my house to do that, so it was easy.
Very cool. Can you share the title, or is there a link so I can put it in the show notes? Should I grab that from you afterwards?
You probably just have to ask Brandon. It's mostly his words.
Okay.
I'll throw a few things in there, but
sure.
He's the smart one.
Okay.
I'm the pretty one.
Oh, man.
Which, if I'm the pretty one, we're in trouble. No, I don't know that I don't know that we've settled on a title, and it is going to be a series. So okay. I know that he's going to be getting a new whatever Book of Face site up and some stuff, and okay. I think it will be under Outlaw Movement. So cool. Hopefully in the next couple of weeks that'll be up, and some people can go and get some information there if they're interested on what we're doing.
Awesome. I'll have to drop him a line and make sure I include that in the show notes. Any links to that stuff. That'll be great.
Yeah, he'll have all the information. I can't be trusted with any of that stuff.
You definitely like to stay low tech.
Yeah, I really do. You know, I mean, I like air conditioning, and that's about it.
There you go.
Hey, just don't live much in the technology world.
Yeah, like I said, you're not missing too much. I think the more we get tapped into technology, the more we really try to value the time when we can like disconnect from it and like be in nature. So it's kind of like, in a way, it's an oxymoron in some ways. You know what I mean?
You know, it's a fantastic thing. I mean, the internet is obviously a pretty powerful tool. I quit going on it a long time ago for the most part, but I mean, there's a lot of information out there, and that's a great thing. You know, the bad thing is there's a lot of information out there, sorting out the good and bad, but there is all kinds of great stuff out there. I just, you know, when it comes to the training world, I remember, this has been a long time, but a guy brought a kettlebell into that gym I was talking about with all the power lifters and Highland Games athletes and things like that. And we messed around. He said, "Hey, swing it, you know, back between your legs like this." And of course we'd all read old, you know, Hackenschmidt and Sandow books and things like that in there. So we knew what it was and knew what a swing was. None of us had ever really done them. So we started messing with that. And I came home and got on the wife's computer and Googled in kettlebell, and there were 3 hits.
Wow.
Now, Google kettlebell today, and I'll bet there's more than that. And, you know, my thought was, oh, crap, everybody knows about these things. I'm behind the time. There's already 3 hits on this stuff. But obviously some things have changed since then. And you've got to credit Pavel, and you've got to credit Gray. You've got to credit a lot of the great people in those organizations, Brett, and all the others that were a big part of pushing that forward, because that's changed the face of fitness. You know, 20 years ago, you know, it was all bodybuilding and step aerobics. You know, it's just there's a different world of performance, and some of it may be good and some of it may be bad. But like I said, there's great information, but none of it actually beats learning from a skilled mentor and applying that hands-on day after day after day after day after day. And I think that's another thing that gets lost that I came to realize is there are a lot of good trainers who train situationally, really good for fitness, that can teach somebody how to press, that can teach somebody how to squat safely and get a workout. It doesn't hurt their shoulders or their knees or whatever. But I think that gets lost when people do that and say they're training athletes, but they only train them at a workshop, or they don't go watch them play, or they don't train them year after year. They train them for a month, you know, or their 6 sessions or whatever the package they sell. But, you know, in my case, I've had to take ownership. So as you know, when I train an athlete for 6 years and I go watch them run, if they're not running well, I can't really blame anybody else, and I have to take ownership of that. And that's when I learned the difference or I began to at least understand the difference in max force production and quality movement. You know, and I don't know if that makes sense, but I mean, it's no secret because I used to talk about it openly all the time. So I don't know what's going on in the community now, and there was nothing wrong with what was happening then, but there was a big push in the old days of the RKC. This was a long time ago. There was a time when there was a focus on swinging with vertical shins, being as much hip as possible, very limited knee movement, no ankle movement. And because that was what was determined to be the max stretch in the hamstrings and the glutes and the highest force production and all that. And that's how I was training my kids to swing. And then I went out there and we did some swings like that for quite a while. And then I went out and watched practice. What's wrong with the way they're running? Something's wrong. Oh, they're not running with their ankles. They're not stepping up higher than the height of their tibial tuberosity. They are running the way I taught them to swing. So that's when I stopped doing things like worrying about how much they could squat exactly to parallel with a low bar powerlifting squat because, hey, we got to be strong, right? That's what I thought. We've got to get to that body weight and a half or double body weight squat. But when I looked at what that squat did year after year after year after year to the nervous system and the fascia versus squatting in a way that was more supportive of appropriate movement, and maybe it took 50 pounds off or whatever, but when they ran faster, jumped higher, what did it matter?
Right.
I think that is back to what we were talking about earlier with the pigeonholing. Because if you're a strongman, you want to do strongman stuff. If you're a gymnast, you want to do gymnast stuff. If you're a corrective guy or a Pilates guy or whatever it is that we fall into, we want to stay with that. And, it gets so hard to sort out that information and stay in our swim lane when it's appropriate, but learn about things in other swim lanes and learn how to integrate them. I think that's what really gets missed is people think they're integrating things. They think they're doing athletic movement stuff, but they never go back to fundamentals. They're just doing drills.
Right.
They think they're doing strength stuff, but they're just picking stuff up and putting it down, not in a way that necessarily makes you run faster, jump higher. And you got to take that with a grain of salt, because I was having this conversation with Brandon earlier today is that, I think if somebody has appropriate or decent movement, whatever that is, and appropriate or decent technique, they're not doing anything dangerous, and they squat more, it's going to help them run faster. Okay. But is it going to help them as much as an appropriate, authentic, mastered squat that can be done in any circumstance with a posture that is not platform specific, but movement specific or movement focused? Because when we get into lifting the most weight just for the sake of lifting the most weight, that's its own sport.
Right.
And, as you don't master two sports simultaneously.
No.
You can play basketball and you can play soccer. And you can get better at both of them simultaneously, but you will not achieve the highest level at both simultaneously. And when you're trying to become a power lifter or an Olympic lifter, then you're trying to perfect two sports. And that is something that it really gets lost, I think, a lot at the high school and college level.
Right. That's very interesting.
And I'm just soapboxing now. I don't know that I'm even saying anything
No,
worthwhile.
that was great. No, absolutely. That was great. That was very informative to hear that. Taking a step back and getting outside of the gym or the training facility and just watching athletes in their sport and seeing how they're moving. I mean, like you said, you step back and you learn a lot by watching. So that was great. Thank you.
If you're working with an athlete for a month, you're showing them stuff. If you work with an athlete multiple times a month for year after year, and you go out and you watch them practice or you watch them play, then you're training an athlete. And there's a difference in showing them something and training them. And not saying it's wrong to show them stuff. I've done that a million times in limited environments. You go into a high school, you do what you can a few times, get them to do something safe and appropriate and effective. And I'm not knocking that. I'm just saying there's a lot of people who say they are training athletes, but it's not really what I look at as training athletes.
Sure. When you take the time to go and observe them and playing in their respective sports, when you watch them play or move, you mentioned the example with the kettlebell swing and then how they were running and how they were jumping. Is there other things that you kind of look for in terms of like a mental checklist to see like that you might not normally show up inside a gym or training setting?
I don't know that I so much go through a checklist. I think it's just the sort of thing that all coaches do after, years of watching. I think it's just kind of an intuitive thing when your education and experience comes together. It's just when you see them in a game environment, there may be something that shows up a little bit differently that might need a little bit more work. So I don't know that I so much go through a mental checklist because I'm showing up to watch kids play a game because I care about their future too. Sure. It's just that I can't help but watch that foot placement, that spinal alignment, things like that.
Right. That's such a great, point to share with myself and everybody that's going to listen is because you wouldn't have ever known to make a change in what they were doing with the kettlebell if you hadn't seen them move in their sport. You would have been still totally unaware of that stuff. So for you, it was a huge learning experience, so that's just a reminder to me to make sure that, I continue to get out and watch them in their respective sports, because you might uncover some things that, don't show up on the gym floor or in a screen or an assessment.
It definitely makes you take ownership in a different way. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And it all depends on the service you think you're providing. And I say I train athletes. So to me, that's important. If I was giving the athletes a workout, then, that's the service I'm providing. I'm not saying that's what everybody has to do. I'm just saying that to me, if I wasn't going and observing, then I don't think that I would be honest in saying that I was training athletes, because I don't know what the product I'm putting out really is if I don't go watch it. That's sure. Quality control.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a great way to look at it. Yeah. That's awesome. Well, you've definitely given me some things to think about and work on for myself.
Well, I'm sorry for that.
Jeff, what are your thoughts on the evolution of the functional movement system and the RKC and the Strong First?
Well, I understand that, I was there in the early days of the RKC, and, I saw it evolve up to the point I initially left with Pavel to Strong First, and then, made a fairly early exit out of that. So anything that's evolved since then, I really can't speak of. I mean, I stay in touch with a few people in the community, some friends I've made that, that share some things, but I don't really know what's changed, and anything I say would be hearsay. Mm-hmm. I tried to stay plugged in with FMS for a little bit, but, ultimately just kind of drifted out of there too for some of the same reasons. So, I can't really say it as to how it has evolved or devolved or whatever.
Okay.
Sorry, I know that's probably not the answer you want.
No, I was more curious from the perspective of someone that was really there, at the beginning. And so you kind of know what it was like before, like all this stuff really kind of rose to popularity and has had such a big community around both of them. So it was more from that standpoint, less from maybe a teaching or material standpoint, because I guess kind of seeing how it's grown,
Well, when I went to the RKC, and it was funny because I used to make fun along with everybody else of the way Pavel was marketed by John DeCane. Okay, the evil Russian. He's not an evil Russian. He's Russian. Okay, but he's not evil. Almost some of the cartoon-like things in the books and things like that. And I used to make fun of it. I didn't like it. I didn't like being associated with it at all. But it got me there. Got Brett Jones there. Got Brandon there. Got all the guys that built it there. So there was a genius there that maybe I didn't recognize at the time. But if it wasn't for John DeCane, there never would have been a Pavel. because Pavel just wanted to be left alone, as far as I could tell. He didn't want to be bothered to really show anybody this stuff. He didn't want to be a rock star out front, but he had a genius that could only have been brought out by that. And it's funny, when I went to the RKC, it was still a bunch of scary guys. Okay. And it was take all the heavy bells outside. There were 16 kilo bells up to 40 kilo bells. And we didn't really use the 16 kilo bells unless you were a small woman. Okay.
Right.
It was take all the 32s and the 40s out. And it was scary guys, with tattoos and big shoulders and looks in their eyes that just weren't the type of people that most people mess with. And I saw it go from that. And there was a lot of great learning. It was wonderful. It was the best systemized thing I'd ever been exposed to of training that made sense. And it wasn't that the concepts, that all the concepts that Pavel was teaching were all brand new or something that nobody had ever been exposed to, but he put them together, sequenced them, and made them make sense in a way that I had certainly never seen, and I don't believe anybody else had. So watching that go from a very organic series of drills and try this and all the fun we had from everybody just having an outlet to, hey, this will make your press better. Try this. And okay, it worked. We'll keep it. And if not, throw it out. And it turned into something pretty amazing. And from what I hear, it's truly moved a lot further away from that. And that was the transition it's making anyway. There was a push to make it more of an instructor certification rather than a gladiator course. And, there was always confusion as to which one. Should it be hard? Should it be teach you to be an instructor? And I think, from what I hear, they still struggle with that. But, far as I know, they're still teaching people how to swing and press a kettlebell safely and effectively. And people like going and, had a lot of friends in that community. And I think it's great. As far as FMS, I came in a little bit later. Brett and I were very good friends. I owe a lot to Brett, or still are very good friends. I owe a lot to him, because if he hadn't kind of kicked me out of my little hole in the woods, then, if it hadn't been for him pushing me and promoting me and things like that, then, you wouldn't care what I have to say. We wouldn't be on this phone call right now. So, if it wasn't for him, I never would have got to have all the wonderful experiences I have. But, he called me and said, hey, do you know anything about this FMS stuff? And I said, no. And he said, well, look into this. I'll send you some information. So I started messing with, I did what I think was the original online course from, way back, in the 1800s or whatever it was. And I got that. Of course, I was peppering him with questions. And, then there was the first CKFMS. And I had done a bunch of screens and, tried to implement a bunch of correctives and drove him insane with a bunch of questions. And, we show up at the airport, and with Gray, we all meet there together and come in. And, my first exposure to Gray was there in the airport, and he's, typical Gray. Everybody loves him. He's a rock star, in a totally opposite way of Pavel. And, so we go into day one of CKFMS, and Brett says, hey, I've got a lecture. Go fix Gray's active straight leg raise. So there's an exposure to FMS for you. So anyway, I got to, get to know Gray a little bit, and, it was great. Obviously he's a genius. He's a rock star. It takes people like John and Pavel and Gray and Lee, and all the supporting cast around him to change the world. And they certainly did that. And then, ultimately there wasn't a place for me there in either place. I'm kind of always the, voice of, hey, that's good, but, couldn't it be better? And, and that my version of better, maybe not everybody else's. So, ultimately it was just time for me to move on, go back to my hole in the woods and just train kids. So, but it was a very amazing experience. I learned a lot, made a lot of great friends, and it certainly sent me on a quest for knowledge that I don't think I could have found in any other situation if it hadn't been for both of those communities. Awesome. And I know they're doing a lot of other stuff at FMS, really trying to, focus on some other aspects of testing and assessing and things like that. And, I haven't been a big part of much of that stuff. They were, just starting the capacity screen when I was kind of finally saying my goodbyes there. I don't know if I ever said goodbye. I just quit getting invited to anything or showing up. So, but it was a great run, but I don't know really too much of what's going on over there. I talk to Brett, but just as friends, not too much about business stuff anymore.
Right.
So
very cool. Well, I'm having a blast sitting back and listening to you and learning from you. It's great to hear your perspective, like I said, from somebody that's seen everything kind of from the beginning and how it's unfolded. It's very cool. So last thing. So before we move into the rapid fire. So Kalosthenos, Kettlebells from the Ground Up, Part 2. Awesome product. Loved some of the things that you had in there. And then, correct me if I'm wrong, I also believe that you had contributed to Dynami as well, right?
Did some writing. I think they called it like a coach's corner, coach's perspective.
I remember that. So one of the things that jumped out at me from Dynami was this great coach's corner from Jeff O'Connor, and you talked about the single leg deadlift and how this is just a fantastic exercise and should really, when appropriate for the individual, be in every athlete's repertoire. Why do you think that is such a great staple to have in there?
Well, I think it's one of the great staples.
Okay.
But there's a lot going on with that. And this is one of those weird things that I truly have trouble even giving an elevator speech to myself about the benefits of, because, I do a lot of single leg training with my athletes, but where in the real world do you spend as much time on one leg as you do when you're doing a pistol or a single leg deadlift? Never. In the real world, single leg stance is purely transitional. So I know it works. I know that a single leg deadlift or a single leg squat or whatever is, I know it's good because it's part of mastering that movement and naturalizing that movement. So it is important. But when you take a single leg deadlift, is it a hip hinge? Okay, yeah, I'll buy it's a deadlift, but there's a lot of other stuff going on too.
Right.
Okay. Everything changes when you dissociate the upper and lower bodies. Okay. When you're running, there's an element of dissociation in your shoulders and your hips. They don't stay, they stay stacked on top of each other, but they don't stay in the exact plane. And we can all deadlift, but all of a sudden, and have a decent looking deadlift, but most of us, one side or the other, at least, we'll lose 40 IQ points when we go to a single leg stance. It's just what happens. So aside from the fact that it's a great way to assess symmetry, it's a great way to really look at some of the motor control that starts to happen as we move up. Yeah, I think you would fit a deadlift into a progression of gait. The same, it would fit in like, an asymmetrical stance, and it's a transitional training pattern. So I think the big thing about that though is it makes our hips do different things.
Right.
And it makes our hips and our shoulders do different things and dissociate while maintaining spinal stability. And there's a little element of shoulder stability in there too. A lot of those same attributes are necessary to run well. And that is, I realize there's different sports, but as human beings, in my opinion, that is the ultimate expression of athleticism. Now, that's funny coming from a guy that played strongman. I used to be able to run really well, and what I did to myself in the process of strongman made me not be able to run so well anymore. Certainly don't have that runner's physique. But, when it comes to training athletes, if you can't run, you're not probably very athletic.
Right. Right.
So,
yeah, absolutely. I can't remember the other question I had from Kalosthenos, from the Kettlebells from the Ground Up. I got the one from Dynami. Is there, all right. So on the fly. So is there anything from that you like to really, focus on or you think is particularly valuable in the get up sequence or any of the transitions that you feel has a lot of carryover similar to the single leg deadlift?
All of them do, but just like with any other movement pattern, if you're going to err on the side of too much time, the lower patterns, when you're down on the ground, moving up to sitting and kneeling positions are, I think for most people, where the real magic happens.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So getting into half kneeling, tall kneeling, those types of transitional postures.
Mm-hmm.
Excellent. All right. Do you have anything else that you want to talk about or add before we move into the rapid fire?
Well, I don't know that I have anything worth saying. I've talked a lot. Used all my words.
Oh, cool. All right. Well, I'll get a couple more out of you, and then I'll let you off the hook.
Okay.
Cool. So this is a series of questions I ask each guest, not topic related to anything that we've covered, but these are just kind of fun and let the audience get to know you a little bit better. So that type of thing. So, Jeff, given all of your knowledge and your experience that you've amassed over your career and your life so far, if you go back in time, what advice would you give yourself 15 years ago?
Honestly, I would have to do it the same, because if I did anything different, I would not have ended up at this point. I wish I could take back the damage that I did to my body playing the game of strongman. But ultimately, if I had not done that, I would not have been in the right place to learn all I did from Pavel and the RKC community and Gray and the FMS community. And, it wouldn't have led me down the path where I could take that and build on it and help the athletes that I train as much as I feel like I've been able to. So, I took the wrong and a roundabout path. I look at somebody, I look at Brandon, who I'm partnered up with on this project. We've been friends and done some things together for a long time. And we started at completely opposite ends of the spectrum and met in the middle. He was classically educated, came through a clinical background, and then came to performance and strength. And I was a knuckle dragging meathead that just loved to spend 8 hours in the gym on Saturday squatting and, strength stuff, and then started training athletes completely by accident and, had to learn the back way and very haphazardly. But I don't know that if I'd have went any other route, I would have got to where I am. So even though it's been wrong and sometimes a little bit painful, the learning process, I got to say that if I wanted to end up right here, I don't see a different way. So I'd probably do it all again, as tough as it was.
That's great. I love that. That was good. If you had to pick one, what's your favorite strength training exercise?
I don't have to pick one. So I don't. I mean, I know that's something we all like to play, mm-hmm. but I don't ever do just one.
Okay. So which ones do you do?
I don't think there is. I think, I could pick a most effective.
Okay.
I mean, if I could only pick one for the vast majority of people, I think obviously it's going to be the get up, but I don't have to only pick that.
Sure.
I can do get ups and then go squat. And I can go do get ups and press. And I can do a lot of other things that I don't even have names for.
Awesome. How has your training changed today, present day, compared to 15 years ago? Your personal training.
15 years ago, my personal training was all about how much I could pick up, throw, or carry off.
Okay.
And today, it is all about how well I move. And it was surprising to me, though, that I never thought that I would have to focus on strength training after all that. But, as I'm nearing 50 years of age, I do have to put a higher focus on actually making sure that, I get enough relatively heavy squatting in. Now, that's an entirely different thing.
Right.
That's 300 pounds, not 700 pounds anymore. But,
Right.
I do have to focus on it, but it's probably a small part. It's really all about how I move. And I truly try to train as an athlete. I try to do as much of the reactive type of stuff as I can. And, it's funny. I have an 18-year-old son, just graduated high school, and he's going off to play college football. And I've trained him his whole life. And it's been very fun for me now. He's doing his prep workouts for college, and that's something I've just on the days I can, I jump in and do with him. So I'm doing college football workouts now, whenever possible. But
that's awesome.
Oddly enough, you might be surprised to know that those are designed for 18-year-olds, not 48-year-olds. It's a little tough on me sometimes.
Yeah, sure.
A lot of volume for an old man.
Oh man. Well, that's fantastic. Congratulations to you and your son.
Oh, thank you.
You're welcome.
I was going to go back and say training. I don't think my training is really that different. It's just how much I focus. There were times that my focus was primarily on how much I could squat and lifting odd implements. I don't lift as many strongman implements, but I lift a lot of different implements in a lot of different ways. And I try to squat as much as I can well. It's just that I spend more time on training in different ranges and planes of motion and less time just in a classic back squat.
Right.
But I would say that the focuses are still the same on being a better athlete, just a different sized athlete now.
Awesome. I love it. What injury have you had, and how did that affect your training and your life?
You broke up. I didn't get that question. I apologize.
No, it's okay. I asked what injury have you had, and how did that affect your training and your life?
I would say the biggest one I had is I had a knee injury when I was in the Navy.
Okay.
And it was, supposedly a relatively minor injury, and had an unsuccessful surgery and no rehab, and went and had another unsuccessful, relatively minor surgery and no rehab. And I would say that emotionally that affected me in a huge way, because I had always, so much of my life was and still is focused around being able to perform physically. And that was the first time my body had ever failed me. And then as part of that, I don't know that I recognized it at the time, but there was a problem on the medical and the clinical side of it there too, because there was really no real rehab available. There wasn't an FMS for a junior enlisted military member in the early 90s. It just wasn't there. So it was a huge impact on me, both physically and mentally, because it never really rehabbed, and I would just fall down for no reason for several years. Right. And, that led to a couple of other injuries, like one time when that was down some stairs and I broke my other leg.
Oh, wow.
But I would say, though, that I was no longer able to run without pain. And although I was always a gym rat, my focus was always on running and jumping and climbing and things before that, a more authentic physical expression. And that's when I got into really lifting heavy. Well, you can't run, so let's race with 800 pounds on your shoulders. That doesn't really make sense in today's world, the way I look at things, but I tried to do that. So for several years, I was squatting horribly. I was pressing horribly. And I just got pretty dysfunctional. So I would say that start of that minor knee injury probably was the biggest overall effect, but it led to some pretty bad stuff. I don't need to sit here and whine, but I've had some spinal things and had some neurological issues from all that dysfunctional heavy weights, and that's why I'm so adamant about the way people train that are under my guidance in today's world. So the biggest effect of all that stuff is that nobody gets hurt lifting and nobody gets hurt playing anymore. So right. I guess at some level it was worth it.
Right. Well, you're doing better now, I hope, right?
Oh yeah. I mean, I don't mean to sound like a little whiny girl. People live with pain, and as I said earlier, you push the limits of the body, you'll find them. I've earned all my scars. But in all truth, I move better than I did when I was 25. I don't move as fast. I don't jump as high, but I move better. I feel better. I can actually go run sprints with my son. Now I can't run very many and I can't keep up with him, but I couldn't do that when I was a strong man. Right. That was one of the things I used to say when I was teaching all the time is I had a trophy nobody cares about. Said North America's strongest man. But I couldn't go play baseball with my son because my shoulders hurt too bad or my knees hurt too bad. There's nothing good about that. For an amateur sport, that is dumb. It really is dumb. So when we see, kids that don't know any better and over enthusiastic or uneducated coaches doing the same thing for high school football or high school baseball or whatever it is, I do what I can to help change that whenever possible. Right on. So you shouldn't have the scars of your sport if you play it at an amateur level. Right.
What's one thing that high school athletes should be doing more of to complement their training and their health?
Did you say high school athletes?
Yes, I did.
Sleeping.
Love that. Can't get enough of that.
I know that's probably not the thing you were looking for.
No, sleep's great. I might get the same answer for my next question, which is, what's your best tip to improve recovery after a training session?
Eating and sleeping.
There you go.
There's a lot of fancy things you can do. There's some low-tech things you can do. A lot of people are big fans of ice baths and saunas and things like that, and I'm all for that. And I know there's some high-tech things that pro athletes use and all that, but for real-world people, eating and sleeping. Get good nutrition in you. Go to bed when the sun goes down.
Keep it simple.
And that'll fix a whole lot of problems.
There you go. Mm-hmm. I got three more.
There's really no substitute.
No, there's not. There's not. Sleep's great. Yeah, absolutely. Jeff, what's your favorite meal?
You're breaking up again. We're getting bad connection here. I'm sorry. I didn't get that question either.
It's okay. What's your favorite meal?
Steak and a bourbon.
Nice. All right. I like it. What's one book everyone should read?
Born to Run.
Yeah, by what's his name? Chris McDougall.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Who have you studied or do you continue to study in your career to improve and get better?
I don't know that I particularly study anybody or anything. Mm-hmm. I try to learn from people I respect. But, when it comes to, if you're talking about reading, I read stuff all over the place. Because really, a press is still a press and a squat is still a squat. So I may read Stoic philosophy. I may read neurology. I just kind of read a little bit of everything and find something that fits into some aspect of the world of training in my life from there. But I don't have anybody in particularly that I just follow now.
Awesome. Yeah. Pulling from all kinds of different resources. I love it. Well, Jeff, that takes us through to the end of the interview, man. This has been a blast. Thanks so much for taking the time to do this.
Well, thanks for asking me to. This was it was kind of fun. It was nice to meet you.
Yeah, absolutely. My pleasure. Hey, just hang on the line. Let me give you a proper goodbye off air.
I hope you enjoyed this brand new episode of the Leo Training Podcast. If you value this content, please take a moment of your time, head on over to iTunes and drop in a 5-star review. Or better yet, take a moment and share it on your favorite social media network, such as Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, or Instagram. And be sure to tune in next week when I have another brand new episode, and my guest will be Danny Clark from MoveNet.
Thanks for listening to the Leo Training Podcast. Subscribe and get even more expert training tips at www.leotraining.io.